Humanity has split the atom, walked on the moon, and mapped the human genome. And yet, some members of our species still treat "do not enter" signs as a personal challenge. Welcome back. Today, we're looking at 10 spectacular individuals who looked common sense dead in the eye, laughed, and immediately removed themselves from the gene pool. Let's dive into the absolute dumbest ways people met their maker. 1. Nos. Suburban backyards are traditionally sanctuaries for quiet barbecues and obsessively manicured lawns. But for 34-year-old Kevin, a steep incline behind his house was merely a blank canvas for a recreational death trap. Kevin was a man who possessed the highly lethal combination of limitless free weekend time, unearned mechanical confidence, and a fundamental disdain for the basic laws of physics. He didn't just want to build a summer slip and slide for the neighborhood. He was determined to construct a high-speed, frictionless thrill ride that defied both municipal zoning laws and basic human instinct. His grand design involved 75 feet of heavy-duty, industrial-grade agricultural tarp laid meticulously down a 45-degree hill that looked less like a playground fixture and more like an Olympic ski jump for the clinically insane. But a wet piece of plastic wasn't enough for our backyard daredevil. To guarantee maximum terrifying acceleration, Kevin opted to lubricate his homemade runway by emptying 3 entire warehouse club-sized jugs of pure cooking oil directly onto the descending surface. Let's take a brief moment to evaluate the spectacularly flawed physics of this brilliant setup. By completely eliminating surface friction on a steep downward slope, any object placed on that tarp would immediately surrender to the relentless pull of gravity, accelerating wildly until a solid object forcefully stopped it. And in Kevin's backyard, that unyielding something was a massive, century-old, immovable solid oak tree standing dead center at the exact bottom of the hill like a biological brick wall. If you asked Kevin about his deceleration strategy, he would confidently explain that he planned to simply use his bare feet as organic brake pads, apparently operating under the delusion that his fleshy heels possessed the stopping power of a commercial jetliner. Standing at the peak of his greasy doom, clad only in swim trunks and absolute arrogance, he actively ignored his neighbor who was frantically yelling over the fence to reconsider this doomed geometry. With a triumphant, profoundly misguided shout, Kevin took a running start and launched himself chest-first onto the canola-soaked runway. The acceleration wasn't just fast, it was terrifyingly instantaneous. Within milliseconds, Kevin transformed from a confident homeowner into a terrified, greased-up human missile hurtling toward the earth at highway speeds. As the colossal trunk of the oak tree rapidly eclipsed his entire field of vision, he desperately slammed his bare, oily feet against the slick plastic, a pathetic braking maneuver that achieved absolutely nothing except adding a pathetic squeaking sound effect to his impending doom. The impact was deafening, immediate, and definitively fatal, as a 200-pound man traveling at roughly 35 miles per hour met the uncompromising density of solid ancient wood. Paramedics didn't even need to rush. They just stood at the top of the hill, marveling at the sheer, undeniable stupidity of the crime scene below. The tree, naturally, didn't drop a single leaf or suffer even a microscopic scratch during the altercation. Kevin's ultimate legacy was a highly confusing coroner's report and a neighborhood cautionary tale about why you should never try to casually outsmart Sir Isaac Newton using cooking oil, definitively proving that nature's obstacles are entirely indifferent to your weekend recreational plans. 2. Julian was the kind of fanatically passionate landscape photographer who genuinely believed that a stunning mountain vista simply wasn't worth capturing unless there was a 70% statistical probability he might perish while photographing it. He operated under the deeply flawed artistic delusion that structural safety guidelines, bright red warning signs, and heavy steel barricades were just bureaucratic suggestions meant to keep untalented amateurs away from the truly spectacular camera angles. It was 4 a.m. in the freezing, thin air of the Colorado Rockies, and Julian had already hiked up a treacherous, icy ridge just to capture the sunrise, driven by a desperate need for the ultimate portfolio shot that would undoubtedly secure his legacy in the insufferable world of high-definition stock imagery. When he finally reached the designated tourist observation deck, he looked out at the breathtaking panoramic view and immediately decided it was far too pedestrian, completely devoid of danger, and utterly lacking in the perilous edge his creative soul demanded. Right in front of him stood a heavy iron railing bearing a vividly colored sign that explicitly stated stepping beyond this point would lead to a sheer, 500-foot drop directly into a jagged granite gorge. To Julian, this wasn't a vital warning, it was a VIP invitation. He effortlessly hopped the metal barrier with his heavy canvas bag of expensive lenses, entirely dismissing the inconvenient fact that the drop below him was deep enough to have its own distinct weather system. To get that perfectly unique, ultra-wide-angle nature shot, he realized he needed to lean his entire upper body backward over the terrifying, echoing abyss. Now, any rational human being choosing to dangle over a deadly cliff would seek a highly secure anchor point, perhaps a bolted steel climbing ring, a sturdy synthetic rope, or literally anything permanently attached to the Earth's crust. Julian, however, opted to place his total trust, and by extension his actual life, into the withered, brittle remnants of a dead pine tree root sticking precariously out of the eroding dirt cliff face. Here's a free survival tip that Julian clearly never received. Dry, rotted wood that has been exposed to decades of harsh alpine blizzards does not possess the structural integrity or tensile strength necessary to support 180 pounds of leaning hipster and thousands of dollars of camera equipment. With his heavy hiking boots teetering on a precarious dusting of loose gravel, Julian locked his freezing fingers firmly around the dead piece of timber, leaned entirely backward over the infinite void, and brought the digital viewfinder to his eye, ready to capture absolute atmospheric majesty. He didn't even get the fleeting satisfaction of pressing the shutter button. The ancient, mummified root didn't slowly give way with a warning creak. It promptly detonated into a useless cloud of dry, powdery dust, the exact microsecond it bore his full body weight. The transition from a brilliant visionary artist to rapidly descending geological debris was staggeringly instantaneous. Julian plunged silently backward into the misty, yawning chasm, embarking on a high-speed, one-way vertical tour of the canyon wall that ended exactly as abruptly and fatally as the unforgiving laws of gravity demand. He bypassed forged steel to trust a dead twig, paying the ultimate terminal price for an aesthetic that no one would ever actually see. 3. What is the exact quantifiable monetary value of a human existence? Philosophers have debated this abstract concept for centuries. Economists have tried to calculate it with complex actuarial formulas, but a 28-year-old New Yorker named Marcus managed to definitively narrow the going rate down to exactly $2.90. Marcus wasn't completely destitute, nor was he in a life-or-death action movie rush to save the city from an impending apocalyptic disaster. He was simply a man violently allergic to the everyday concept of municipal transit fares. He was the type of aggressively stubborn urban commuter who viewed paying for the subway not as a basic civic duty to maintain infrastructure, but as a deep personal insult from the transit authority, a minor financial grievance that he was fiercely determined to outsmart on sheer, misplaced principle. It was a bleak Tuesday morning in a poorly lit Manhattan subway station, the kind of subterranean echo chamber that permanently smells like stale pretzels, damp concrete, and exceptionally bad daily decisions. As Marcus confidently marched toward the formidable row of stainless steel turnstiles, he noticed a temporary lapse in the presence of bored transit police officers. Instead of just swiping a transit card like a normal, functioning member of modern society, his brain immediately defaulted to entering an entirely unearned stealth acrobat mode. Let's closely examine the complex biomechanics of a successful turnstile vault. It requires a precise combination of core strength, vertical lift, and spatial awareness to safely propel an entire human body cleanly over a rotating metal bar positioned awkwardly at waist height. Marcus, a man whose primary form of physical exertion was furiously typing complaints on his smartphone, possessed absolutely none of these crucial athletic traits. He backed up, took a deep, dramatic breath as if preparing to vault for an Olympic gold medal in the cheapskate decathlon, and charged the metal gate with completely blind confidence. At the critical moment of required liftoff, his physical execution failed spectacularly. Instead of gliding over the security barrier like a majestic urban gazelle, his heavy lead foot slammed directly into the unyielding steel bar, completely arresting his forward momentum while his upper body foolishly continued its desperate, high-speed journey forward. This disastrous physical miscalculation instantly turned the lock turnstile into a deadly pivot point, violently launching Marcus into a wildly uncontrolled, airborne front flip. His arms never got the memo to brace for impact. The unforgiving, decades-old subterranean concrete floor rushed up to meet him, and he landed entirely upside down, taking the absolute entirety of his descending body weight directly onto the fragile crown of his skull. The loud, unforgiving thud echoed loudly through the cavernous transit station, instantly halting the busy morning commute of dozens of terrified coffee-holding onlookers. Nobody swooped in with a dramatic last-second rescue. No bystander heroically leaped to perform CPR. The devastating physical impact was so sudden, severe, and devastatingly complete that Marcus instantly expired right there in the damp, chewing gum-stained dust of the station floor before anyone could even scream for a medic. He successfully executed a clumsy, completely avoidable gymnastic maneuver that saved him a grand total of pocket change, permanently canceling his own subscription to the land of the living over pocket change. 4. Yellowstone National Park is essentially a heavily regulated minefield of geothermal horrors, disguised as a family vacation destination. The federal government generously provides miles of elevated wooden boardwalks and enough bright warning signs to visually overstimulate a fighter pilot, all explicitly begging visitors to not take a permanent, boiling bath in the acidic supervolcano. Enter Chad, a profoundly arrogant tourist who operated under the tragic delusion that nature's safety barriers were simply velvet curtains keeping the uncool masses away from the best interactive exhibits. Chad had become obsessively fixated on a mesmerizing neon blue thermal spring that looked deceptively like a luxury resort swimming pool, willfully ignoring the thick, sulfurous steam violently hissing from its surface. He simply couldn't fathom why the park rangers wouldn't let him manually verify the water temperature with his bare hands like some sort of khaki-clad scientist. Dismissing the robust chain-link fences and a pictorial sign literally showing a human figure dissolving, Chad boldly vaulted the perimeter to claim his prize. A quick reality check that Chad desperately needed. The seemingly solid ground immediately surrounding these vibrant pools isn't actually rock at all. It is a dangerously fragile, microscopic crust of dried minerals suspended directly over highly pressurized, subterranean vats of boiling sulfuric acid. To Chad's deeply untrained and historically stupid eyes, this deadly crust looked like premium, load-bearing concrete. Radiating the unearned swagger of a man who routinely ignores allergic reaction warnings, he confidently stepped off the federally mandated wooden safety planks and confidently planted his heavy steel-toed hiking boot onto the deceptive mineral shelf. He wasn't even granted the cinematic luxury of a slow, dramatic realization. The impossibly thin geological frosting crumbled beneath his immense, foolishly distributed weight with the crisp snap of a stale saltine cracker. Chad plunged straight down, completely submerging his entire body into a blindingly hot, highly acidic subterranean cauldron, currently simmering at roughly 205 degrees Fahrenheit. There was absolutely no heroic rescue attempt, no frantic throwing of an emergency rope, and practically zero time for a prolonged dramatic scream. The sheer, overwhelming thermal shock of the boiling, corrosive liquid caused a complete and immediate system shutdown almost instantaneously, swiftly, and permanently concluding his wilderness itinerary. By the time horrified park rangers arrived to survey the steaming aftermath of his arrogant little detour, the acidic environment had already begun rapidly erasing his physical presence from the geological record. Chad didn't just die in the national park. He became a permanent, unseen mineral deposit in the exact natural wonder he felt so fiercely entitled to touch, achieving the ultimate merger with nature that no park ranger could have predicted. 5. Every power tool comes with a safety manual, and every safety manual exists because somebody, somewhere, did something unspeakably dumb. But nobody in the history of occupational stupidity has ever ignored those instructions quite as creatively as a 24-year-old framing carpenter named Billy, a man who possessed an absolutely catastrophic cocktail of unchecked workplace boredom and a wildly unearned belief that he was the reincarnated soul of a legendary frontier gunslinger. Billy was tasked with operating a top-of-the-line, heavy-duty cordless framing nailer, an incredibly powerful, battery-operated industrial tool specifically engineered to effortlessly punch 3-inch steel spikes through solid oak beams. To prevent these portable power tools from accidentally turning a suburban subdivision into an active war zone, manufacturers thoughtfully install a rigid, spring-loaded contact safety tip on the barrel. The mechanism physically refuses to fire a projectile unless that specific metal tip is pressed forcefully against a hard, stable surface. Billy, however, felt this crucial, life-saving mechanism severely hindered his ability to unleash a rapid-fire barrage of construction fasteners. Operating in a state of absolute, undeniable idiocy, he used 3 thick layers of industrial-grade duct tape to permanently pin the safety contact completely flush against the barrel, fully arming the device. When the midday lunch break finally rolled around, Billy enthusiastically decided to bless his weary, sandwich-eating coworkers with a dazzling, impromptu display of his imaginary gunslinging prowess. He confidently disconnected his frontal lobe, picked up the illegally modified 12-pound piece of heavy machinery, and attempted to violently twirl it backward around his right index finger like a seasoned rodeo cowboy showing off at a saloon. Let's temporarily ignore the sheer, awkward physical bulk of the battery pack and focus entirely on the chaotic ergonomics of a spinning power tool. As Billy violently swung the heavy nail gun backward, the bulky, unbalanced handle predictably wobbled off its intended axis. The absurdly bulky, awkwardly proportioned plastic housing bounced hard off his heavy canvas tool belt, directly rebounding upward until the metal barrel pointed squarely at the exact center of his own chest. His finger, frantically trying to regain a secure grip on the wildly slipping handle, naturally clamped down incredibly hard on the exposed, highly sensitive trigger. Because Billy had brilliantly disabled the literal only safety mechanism standing between his continued existence and the afterlife, the heavy tool did exactly what it was flawlessly engineered to do. With a deafening mechanical thud, it instantly fired a 3-inch galvanized steel framing nail at point-blank range directly into Billy's torso. The impact was immediate, devastating, and irreversible. He crumpled into the fresh sawdust without a sound, bypassing the emergency room entirely and permanently clocking out of his final shift on the spot, forever immortalized as the absolute only man in local history to bring a modified power tool to a fatal, one-sided imaginary gunfight. 6. A severe midlife crisis usually forces a wealthy man to purchase a terribly ill-fitting leather jacket, a poorly researched cryptocurrency portfolio, or a shiny red convertible sports car. But for an eccentric German industrialist named Dieter, only fully operational, historically accurate armored warfare would suffice to fill the void. Dieter didn't just buy a quirky vintage vehicle for Sunday drives. He spent a small, outrageous fortune purchasing, importing, and meticulously restoring a fully functional 30-ton World War II Panzer tank. He treated this colossal, tracked machine of global destruction like a beloved, grotesquely oversized family SUV, proudly parading its deafening exhaust around his sprawling rural estate and occasionally terrifying the bewildered local livestock. Dieter had developed a deeply unearned, almost pathological sense of absolute personal invincibility while sitting behind 3 inches of blast-proof military-grade steel, blissfully ignoring the incredibly basic fact that while tanks are expertly designed to effortlessly deflect incoming enemy artillery shells, they remain wildly, tragically susceptible to the unforgiving laws of terrestrial gravity. On a particularly sunny weekend afternoon, Dieter decided to take his massive steel behemoth for a thunderous, celebratory joyride through the picturesque, highly unprepared countryside. His chosen, highly destructive route brought him directly face-to-face with a charming, incredibly old masonry bridge spanning a remarkably deep, fast-moving, and notoriously muddy local river. Now, the local municipal government had very helpfully posted a bright, highly visible, reflective metal sign explicitly warning that the aging, historic stone structure had a strict maximum weight capacity of just 3 tons, a structural limit specifically designed for modern compact cars and the occasional wandering farm tractor. Dieter, thoroughly intoxicated by the roaring horsepower of his massive diesel engine and the impenetrable thickness of his historical armor plating, looked at the rural weight limit and genuinely decided that such trivial, bureaucratic municipal suggestions simply did not apply to a triumphant, self-appointed panzer commander. He confidently ground the heavy transmission into a low gear and aggressively drove roughly 60,000 pounds of concentrated German steel directly onto the fragile, ancient cobblestones. The resulting physical structural failure wasn't a slow, dramatic Hollywood creak that afforded a chance for escape. It was an instantaneous, catastrophic disintegration of historic, load-bearing infrastructure. The ancient stone pillars practically evaporated into dust underneath the immense, highly concentrated pressure of the steel treads. As the bridge instantly collapsed into a violent cloud of masonry debris, the enormously top-heavy military vehicle immediately plummeted, nose first toward the rushing water below. Because basic physics rigidly dictates that the heaviest, most armored part of a falling object will aggressively seek the earth, the tank rapidly inverted upside down during its gut-wrenchingly brief, terrifying descent. It crashed heavily into the murky riverbed with a deafening, muddy splash, sinking deeply and immediately into the thick, suffocating sediment. The incredibly heavy steel escape hatches, which strictly open outward by design, were instantly and permanently pinned completely shut against the solid, unyielding river bottom. Dieter essentially drove himself straight into a fully sealed, impregnable underwater vault, tragically and ironically drowning in total darkness inside the very machine he arrogantly believed made him entirely immortal. 7. There is an infuriating breed of exotic pet owner who genuinely believes they have forged a deep, spiritual bond with an apex predator possessing the neurological complexity of a damp pine cone. Meet Travis, an amateur herpetologist who treated his 7-foot, heavily muscled reticulated python less like a primitive predator and more like a scaly golden retriever. Travis operated under the tragically misguided delusion that because he routinely provided thawed rats to this beast, the snake had magically developed complex mammalian emotions like gratitude and restraint. To fully appreciate his impending fatal error, we must briefly consult the evolutionary biology of a large constrictor. They do not possess the brain capacity for affection. They are essentially just highly efficient, self-propelled tubes of solid muscle programmed by millions of years of ruthless evolution to aggressively neutralize any warm, pulsating object they encounter. During a lively Saturday evening apartment gathering, heavily fueled by cheap domestic beer and a desperate need for social validation, Travis decided to entertain his slightly nervous friends with an impromptu wildlife demonstration. He marched to the glass terrarium, confidently hoisted the 80-pound reptile over his shoulders, and casually wrapped its thick coils directly around his own unprotected throat like a wildly inappropriate, avant-garde winter scarf. He proudly began to deliver a slurred, highly inaccurate lecture about how misunderstood these gentle giants truly are, blatantly ignoring the fundamental biological reality that he had just voluntarily strapped an organic vice grip over his own carotid arteries. As the ambient room temperature dropped slightly, the cold-blooded python instinctively sought out the warmest available surface, which unfortunately happened to be the vital, rapidly pulsing blood vessels supplying oxygen directly to Travis's foolish brain. The snake simply did what nature flawlessly designed it to do. It gave a firm, inquisitive squeeze. The situation escalated from a quirky party trick to a fatal medical emergency in roughly 3 seconds. As the immense, unrelenting pressure instantly cut off crucial blood flow to his cerebral cortex, Travis's smug smile was immediately replaced by sheer, oxygen-deprived panic. He desperately attempted to wedge his trembling fingers underneath the dense scales to pry the animal loose. But trying to outmuscle a fully grown constrictor wrapped around your windpipe is functionally identical to trying to pry open a locked steel bank vault with a plastic spork. His friends, initially assuming this desperate, bug-eyed struggle was just a dramatic part of the educational show, simply stood there holding their beers and watching intently. Travis collapsed violently onto the living room carpet, struggling for a few pathetic moments before slipping entirely into permanent, irreversible darkness. He successfully proved to his traumatized friends that the animal was operating exactly up to factory specifications, leaving behind an ironic police report and a man who literally loved his pet to death. 8. Earl was the kind of old-school farmer who made his own beef jerky, distrusted the internet, and firmly believed that there was absolutely no problem on God's green earth that couldn't be fixed with duct tape or a loaded firearm. He was a stubborn, deeply traditional agricultural enthusiast who firmly believed that literally any pest control problem on his property could be swiftly and efficiently solved by the liberal application of high-velocity lead. Upon discovering a particularly bold, oversized rat brazenly exploring the interior of his cavernous, totally empty steel grain silo, Earl bypassed perfectly logical solutions like setting a standard spring trap, deploying toxic bait, or simply adopting an aggressive barn cat. Instead, he boldly opted for a wildly disproportionate, cinematic approach to rural extermination, casually grabbing his trusty, bolt-action .22 caliber hunting rifle from the dusty porch. Now consider the deeply flawed geometric realities of Earl's chosen battlefield. A modern grain silo is essentially a massive, perfectly cylindrical echo chamber constructed entirely out of thick, unyielding industrial steel. Firing a hardened metal projectile inside a fully sealed, curved steel bowl is functionally identical to recklessly playing a game of supersonic, high-stakes pinball, where you are simultaneously the only player and the primary, entirely unprotected target. Completely oblivious to these fundamental laws of acoustic physics and kinetic energy, Earl boldly climbed up the exterior metal ladder, squeezed his bulky frame directly through the narrow top access hatch, and dropped down into the dim, metallic belly of the beast to hunt his tiny, whiskered prey. Spotting the rat scurrying frantically along the curved bottom edge where the steel floor seamlessly met the reinforced wall, Earl confidently raised the firearm to his shoulder, closed one eye, and took careful, deliberate aim at a harsh downward angle. He didn't even hesitate before aggressively squeezing the heavy metal trigger. The sharp, deafening crack of the rifle shot was immediately followed by the terrifying, high-frequency zing of a deformed bullet instantly changing direction at roughly 1,000 feet per second. The lead projectile slammed relentlessly into the impenetrable steel floor, instantly flattened out into a jagged, aerodynamic razor blade, smoothly rode the curved internal architecture of the silo, and sharply ricocheted directly backward into the highly restricted space. Earl didn't even have the microscopic fraction of a second required to register his catastrophic architectural miscalculation. The rebounding bullet found Earl before Earl ever found the rat, delivering an instant fatal blow to the stubborn, physics-denying marksman who never saw it coming. He collapsed silently onto the cold, dusty steel floor, instantly expiring in the dark, cavernous echo chamber of his own remarkably stupid design. When his confused family finally located him several hours later, they were forced to confront the incredibly grim, undeniable reality that Earl had successfully managed to lock himself inside a giant metal drum, spectacularly lose a chaotic confrontation to an utterly defenseless rodent, and permanently remove himself from the local census in the process. 9. The community of amateur historical reenactors is generally populated by detail-oriented history buffs who simply want to spend their weekends wearing itchy wool uniforms and pretending to camp in the 18th century. However, when you dangerously mix a surplus of historical weaponry with a staggering amount of cheap Kentucky bourbon, you essentially create a ticking time bomb of unparalleled stupidity. Greg was a weekend warrior who genuinely believed his rented, uncomfortable cavalry uniform somehow magically granted him the rugged, invincible constitution of a battle-hardened artillery commander. The official daytime reenactment had concluded gracefully, but the deeply intoxicated evening afterparty around the roaring campfire was just shifting into high gear. Looking around at his incredibly drunk friends, Greg boldly proposed a colossally moronic new drinking game. Playing a casual game of catch using a solid, 10-pound iron cannonball fired directly out of a fully functional antique field cannon. Let's firmly establish the terrifying physics of archaic artillery. A solid iron sphere designed strictly to effortlessly pulverize heavy wooden ship hulls does not suddenly transform into a friendly, aerodynamic pigskin just because you ask it nicely. To make this reckless stunt supposedly safe, his inebriated commanding officer decided to drastically reduce the standard explosive charge, carelessly pouring what he drunkenly estimated to be a tiny, harmless sprinkle of highly volatile black powder directly into the weapon's barrel. They essentially operated under the incredibly flawed cartoon logic assumption that a smaller explosion would gently lob the immensely heavy iron bowling ball through the air like a slow-motion softball pitch. Greg confidently strutted exactly 30 yards down the dark field, dramatically pounded his chest, deeply bent his knees, and eagerly held his bare hands out like a wide receiver desperately waiting for the ultimate touchdown pass. The drunk cannoneer enthusiastically touched a burning match directly to the antique fuse. The resulting explosion wasn't a gentle pop. It was a deafening, chest-rattling boom of rapidly expanding, highly pressurized lethal gases. The 10-pound sphere of solid iron rocketed from the barrel at well over 200 feet per second, traveling in a spectacularly flat, brutally aggressive, utterly unstoppable trajectory. Greg managed to keep his eyes open just long enough to see the blurry, metallic messenger of death rapidly eclipse the glowing campfire. He enthusiastically raised his hands to catch it, a deeply pathetic biological gesture that the immense kinetic energy completely ignored. The heavy iron ball effortlessly bypassed his outstretched arms, delivering a catastrophic, instantly fatal blow that launched Greg violently airborne, sending him tumbling backward into the dark tree line like a ragdoll fired from a medieval siege engine. When paramedics finally arrived, they faced the uniquely absurd challenge of having to officially classify a 21st century death as an 18th century battlefield casualty. 10. Los Angeles is world famous for its endless sunshine, terrible traffic, and a sprawling, highly engineered network of colossal concrete spillways specifically designed to efficiently funnel millions of gallons of unexpected rainwater directly into the ocean. These gigantic drainage trenches are a marvel of modern civic infrastructure, but they are most definitively not a taxpayer-funded extreme sports water park. Unfortunately, this basic distinction was entirely lost on Kyle and Tyler, two enthusiastically reckless adrenaline junkies whose entire shared personality revolved around making terribly short-sighted, highly spontaneous decisions. When a rare, spectacularly massive atmospheric river suddenly dumped inches of torrential rain onto the parched mountains, the dry, graffiti-covered concrete channels instantly transformed into raging, incredibly violent, chocolate-colored artificial rivers. While sensible citizens locked their doors, Kyle and Tyler enthusiastically grabbed a pair of cheap foam boogie boards, hopped a tall chain-link fence prominently displaying dozens of severe municipal warning signs, and blindly leaped directly into the roaring 30-mile-per-hour urban current. For anyone who has never stared directly into a flooded drainage channel, here's what you need to understand about the horrifying hydraulic dynamics of a city spillway. This isn't a bubbly, predictable ocean wave gently rolling toward a sandy beach. It is a chaotic, relentlessly churning nightmare of unstoppable kinetic energy, heavily saturated with jagged tree branches, rusty shopping carts, and toxic urban runoff. For the first terrifyingly exhilarating mile, the two amateur stuntmen were actually having the absolute time of their tragically short lives, whooping and hollering as they effortlessly glided down the wide, open-air concrete chute at borderline highway speeds. However, because their rigorous pre-trip planning consisted entirely of high-fiving each other in a driveway, they completely failed to consult a publicly available municipal drainage map. They were wildly oblivious to the terrifying reality that the massive, wide-open channel abruptly funneled directly underground, violently squeezing the raging millions of gallons of water into a pitch-black, entirely submerged, 4-foot-wide cylindrical concrete outflow pipe. As the terrifying, gaping black mouth of the subterranean tunnel rapidly approached through the muddy spray, the fleeting illusion of control instantly vanished. There was absolutely no gentle shoreline to bail out onto, no safety rope to grab, and no functioning brakes on a piece of buoyant foam. The immense, violently swirling hydraulic vortex mercilessly sucked both panicked men directly into the suffocating, freezing darkness of the submerged tunnel. They were instantly and violently pinned against a deeply wedged, rusted tangle of heavy construction rebar by thousands of pounds of unrelenting, inescapable water pressure. No amount of thrashing or adrenaline could overcome the physics at play. The crushing, violent weight of the entire city's storm runoff proved completely inescapable, ensuring their underground adventure ended in complete darkness within seconds. when specialized sanitation workers finally fished their unfortunate remains out of a grim collection grate 3 days later. It served as a permanent reminder that treating vital civic flood infrastructure like your own personal wave pool is a fantastic way to permanently wash yourself right out of the human gene pool. And there you have it. 10 grim reminders that natural selection is still very much alive, working overtime on the weekends. If you made it through this video without deciding to wrestle a python or weaponize your power tools, congratulations, you've survived another day. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next masterclass in human stupidity. Stay safe out there.